Okay, let's get started with cinnamon rolls. So this cinnamon roll recipe takes a couple hours. It's going to take some time. With yeast, we need to make sure that we're activating the yeast, it's coming alive, and then it has a long rise time. The other thing that we've talked about in class with our yeast is that when it has this rise time, we want to create a warm environment for it to rise. So in the classroom setting, it's awfully breezy and kind of cold. So we do things here in the classroom to create that warm environment. More often than not, if you're making this at home, your home is probably warm enough already. But if it's not, there's certain things that we can do to create a warm environment to keep our yeast kind of warm and happy and keeping it alive. One of those would be turning your oven on. So when I turn my oven on, in this specific oven, if I turn my oven on, I have little vents on the back here, and then these vents let excess heat from the oven escape, so I can kind of harbor that warm air to keep my dough rising in a warm environment if I had to. If you have an electric stove, sometimes your back burner will get hot if your oven is on, because that's again the same thing, heat is escaping, so you can kind of huddle your dough over there, get your bowl over there, kind of wrap a towel around it, kind of harbor that warm air, but not too hot. We've talked a lot about being too hot. We don't want things that are too hot to killing the yeast. We want that good temperature here. What I have for the classroom is actually a really nice piece of equipment that I have. Let's see if we can get this over here. But I have this hot box here. So this is just a warm box. It's electric. It has a pan of water down on the bottom, hard to see, but it's a proofer. So we'll talk a little bit about yeast spreads and needing a proofer. Again, this is just a big, giant box, and it's creating my warm environment for my dough. Really, really handy, especially for this type of environment where it's kind of drafty, a little cold. I want that warm environment. So I'm going to use that. In the classroom, we'll use that. Professional bakers will use that. Because they're able to control it. I've got dials on the bottom. I can control how hot, or not really cold, but how hot or warm I want that. The other reason it's really great for professional bakers is now they have somewhere for all of their dough to be. I'm not taking up extra counter space. If I have like a huge project where I'm making lots and lots of dough, I can put everything on sheet pans, get it in one spot, and I can use my proofer that way. So I'll use that. That's what we have for the classroom. So keep in mind that warm spot. If you need a warm spot to get your dough to rise, the oven trick is pretty good. But like I said, most just home temperatures. Maybe if you have a home that just kind of runs really warm, like I know my sister's house is always super hot, I would never need to turn the oven on because she always likes it really warm in there. So just kind of think about, do you think that your home is kind of cold? Do you need to turn your oven on for the sake of your yeast being there? So there's a whole long list of ingredients here. So I'm going to just go through the ingredient list first, and then of course I'll go step by step as I go through the steps. But let me just knock out all these ingredients first. So we have half a cup of the warm milk. Half cup warm milk. So I have pre-measured my milk. I've got a lot of mise en place out as well. Used my liquid measuring device here. So half a cup of warm milk is what we'll need. And then our yeast. So I have active dry yeast here. It's just little granules. This yeast we're going to need 3/4 of a teaspoon. 3/4 of a teaspoon of yeast. We need sugar, and it says sugar divided, so that means that we're going to add sugar in a couple different spots of our recipe here. So 2 tablespoons of sugar divided. So when I make my dough, I'm going to add some sugar at the beginning and then get some towards the end. So 2 tablespoons of sugar divided, so you can just measure that as you go. That's what I'll do. If you wanted to get more prep bowls out and have a prep bowl with 1 tablespoon and 1 tablespoon, go for it. Flour. I need 1 3/4 cup flour. 1 3/4 cup flour. 1 each egg, just 1 whole egg here. It says at room temperature. So again, talking with yeast, I'm doing a lot of effort to get everything warm. I need to warm my milk when I get there. It's not warm yet because I got a lot of talking. I want a warm environment. I want butter that's softened or melted, depending on where we're at. But I'm doing all these things to get a warm environment. So if I just do all of that, get my yeast with this warm environment, and then I throw a cold egg in there, I'm dropping that temperature down drastically, and I'm kind of slowing this process of what I want my yeast to do, which is be alive. So my first bit of butter here is I have 1 tablespoon of butter melted. This is for the dough. You'll notice butter is listed throughout the ingredient list here. My first part here is that I need 1 tablespoon of butter. This will need to eventually be melted, but this is for the dough. This is going to go inside of the dough itself. And then I have salt for 1/4 teaspoon of salt. 1/4 teaspoon salt. I have butter again, so this butter that is soft butter for spreading. So this is 3 tablespoons of soft butter for spreading. 3 tablespoons soft butter for spreading. To paint a picture, this is going to be when we have our dough and we roll it out, and then we'll spread the butter, sprinkle our cinnamon and sugar on it. That's what that's for. And then the cinnamon and sugar for sprinkling in there is going to be 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. So 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, the small one. And then your sugar that you're going to mix that with is going to be 2 tablespoons. So making sure that you're getting your measurements correct. You're going to have more sugar than you are cinnamon in your mixture here. So you don't want it too pungent with cinnamon. It's going to be a little too much. So 2 teaspoons cinnamon, 2 tablespoons sugar. Then we've got butter one more time here. I need 1 tablespoon butter melted for the top of the rolls. So 1 tablespoon butter. This will be melted, and my finished product, I'm going to brush it over the top of the rolls and then get it into the oven. And then the last thing here is just additional flour for rolling out. So we just want to make sure we have a little additional flour that we're going to put on our countertop for rolling everything out. All right, so let's get started. So the first step here, it says to heat the oven to 300 degrees to create a warm place for the dough to rise if needed. So just what I was talking about, if we need to create that warm environment, I have preheat the oven for 300 degrees if you need to create that warm environment. So sometimes just the top of your stove gets kind of warm. If you know it has a little vent there that kind of spits out some warm air, you can kind of use that. But 300 is kind of where I go with that. And also depending on how warm your home is. So if you don't think that you need it and you can just kind of wrap some towels around it, great, do that. Don't turn the oven on if you don't think you need to. Again, we're just trying to create this warm environment to give our yeast a happy place to rise. All right, so step 2, starting to get some dough. I'm going to be using my KitchenAid mixer here. I have the KitchenAid mixer that I'm going to use with my dough hook. You could do this with just a bowl and a wooden spoon, and then when it comes to kneading and working the dough, you would just do that by hand. This one, I have the mixer. The mixer's going to do a little bit of work for me. So if you need to knead this by hand and work the dough by hand, we can certainly do that. I'll show you that. Takes a little elbow grease, but it's just fine. It's a little bit better in my opinion, because then now once your hands are on the dough, you get a good feel for what's going on with the dough if you're touching it. So for step 2 here, I have in the bowl of a stand mixer, add the 1/2 cup warm milk. And your first blank, or sorry, your blank here in step 2 is sprinkle with 3/4 teaspoon of yeast. So I need to go heat up my milk, and I will be right back. All right, I've got warm milk here. So the recipe says a 1/2 cup of warm milk, about 110 degrees. So I have a thermometer here that's helping me tell how hot it really is. That's really helpful. If you don't have a thermometer, you can kind of feel it. We definitely want warm. We don't want hot. Like, I don't want to be able to not hold this. You could kind of do that like baby bottle test. Some parents might remember if you're testing some milk just kind of on this tender part of your wrist, the inside of your wrist, it's just really tender here. So if you can tolerate some warm milk there, you're probably good to go. But again, thinking with our yeast, we want it to work for us. So we're going too cold won't wake it up. Too hot is going to kill it. So we want that fine line. And 110 range. So if you were in the range of maybe like 105 to maybe 115, you're probably good to go. You don't have to spin forever kind of really going back and forth, seeing how hot it is. I just did that in the microwave. That little bit of milk came out of the refrigerator. I did it in the microwave for about 40 seconds, and it seemed to work really well for me in the bowls that I have. So, moving on to my yeast. So my yeast, I'm going to sprinkle 3/4 of a teaspoon of the yeast onto my warm milk. So I literally am just going to sprinkle, and the whole reason I want to sprinkle this is I just really want this to have like even distribution of yeast. I want to be able to see a nice layer. I have this nice layer of yeast. So what you see there, that brown kind of top, that's the yeast that's just evenly spread over my warm milk. So all of my yeast has some sort of contact with warm milk. And it's not just dumped in. If it's just dumped in, then I have kind of this glob of yeast that's sitting in the middle of this warm milk. Like I said, I want to kind of create this larger surface area so all that yeast is being able to wake up and have contact with that warm milk. So step 2 is that in the bowl of the stand mixer, or whatever bowl you're going to be mixing in, I have my 1/2 cup of warm milk. I sprinkled my 3/4 teaspoon of yeast, and I'm going to let it sit covered with a kitchen towel for 7 minutes at room temperature. So 7 minutes, it's just literally a kitchen towel. Again, trying to harbor in that warm heat there. And then I got 7 minutes. I'm going to let this sit, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, 7 minutes is up. All I have is my warm milk with my yeast. There isn't a whole lot to see here. Some of the yeast has kind of settled down. I can see it's starting to look a little foamy around the edges if I look really close, but it's also aromatic. I can really smell that yeast is kind of coming alive here. So I am ready to move on to my next steps. So that would be step 3. So in step 3 here, I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of flour. And this is out of my main ingredient list of 1 3/4 cups. So we're gonna have to do a little bit of kitchen math here soon with step 4 to figure out how much flour to add later. But for right now, I need to add a 1/4 cup of flour into this bowl, 1 tablespoon of sugar, so that's off that sugar that's divided. So this is that first tablespoon. I'm going to whisk that till blended into my yeast and milk mixture here, cover with plastic wrap, and let rise in a warm place for 30 to 45 minutes. So that's where my oven will come into play if I need it, but I'm going to use my proof box. So let's get started here. 1/4 cup of my flour. Kind of sprinkle that, just again trying not to get a big clump of it fall into the bottom there. 1 tablespoon of my sugar. My whisk, this will be the only time I use a whisk, but I want to get that sugar mix and that flour mix all hanging out with the yeast. I want to feed my yeast that sugar. And if there's flour clumps, don't worry about it. We're going to get more like a dough in this later. So this is just our yeast, sugar, milk, a little bit of flour. So let me get plastic on this. So a nice tight-fitting plastic, you can help it. And then if this is just going on your counter at home, plastic, a towel would be great, maybe a couple towels, maybe you can do a towel on top and then maybe kind of one around the edge to kind of hold in that warm milk we still have. Whatever you can to kind of get that warm environment. Maybe this apparatus here needs to go over to the oven side. Again, if your oven is on, maybe you're baking something else already, but whatever we can do to get that nice and warm. Like I said, this is just going to hang out in my proofer here because I have it, but some sort of warm environment. I can see that my plastic wrap's already starting to kind of frost up, get a little foggy in there because there's still some warm air in there. That's great, exactly what I need. So for this one, I'm gonna leave this be for 30 to 45 minutes. I want to be able to see some foaminess on top when I'm done. That's when I know I'm done. So I will let this sit for 30 to 45 minutes. So after 30 minutes of some rise time, some activation of my yeast in a warm place, again, aromatic, I just took that plastic wrap off, and I'm definitely getting, it smells like yeast spread in here. So you can, hopefully you can see that kind of definition where it's foamy. See how it looks kind of pillowy on top? That's exactly what you're looking for. That is some of those CO2 bubbles starting to develop, and we have our yeast that's alive, and it's growing. It's creating all those little CO2 bubbles. It's eating the sugar and burping them up. So let's move on, and then we're gonna, with this next step 4, is we're creating our dough. So with step 4, once the yeast mixture is foamy, so like I said, I see all the little bubbles on top. It looks foamy. I moved it around. It looks a little pillowy on top. So that blank there on step 4 is foamy. Once the mixture is foamy, after sitting for approximately 30 minutes, whisk. So we're going to use that whisk one more time. I lied about using it one time. We're going to use it twice here. So I'm going to whisk in 1 egg. So my 1 room temperature egg, I'm going to whisk in my remaining tablespoon of sugar. So the remaining tablespoon of sugar, that was the 2 tablespoons that were divided. If you don't have a room temperature egg, you could, like if you were doing this in a rush and you were like, oh no, I forgot to pull my egg out a few hours early and it's still cold, you could run that egg within the shell, so the whole egg that's in the shell, you could run that under warm or hot running water. Again, that's just to get the chill off the egg, so it doesn't drop your temperature down. So run that under hot water a few minutes. Again, it's just taking the chill off of there. So if you didn't remember to pull an egg out, if you're doing this at home, don't worry, you can get around it by running the water under it. And then I have the 1 tablespoon of melted butter. This is my 1 tablespoon of melted butter. It's going into my dough. And my 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So I'm just going to use my whisk to mix this somewhat gently. Kind of with my muffin method where I use that whisk just to break up the egg yolk. That's all I'm doing. I'm not going to go crazy, because I am going to get this onto my mixer with my dough hook. It's just that this dough hook doesn't effectively mix those items together. Sometimes that yolk just goes swimming around the bowl for a while, and it takes a while for the dough hook to come in contact with that. So that whisk is kind of getting this mixture a little bit of a head start here. So your second blank in step 4 says using the dough hook. So I'm going to use my dough hook. Using the dough hook attachment of the mixer, add remaining flour. Slowly add flour 1/2 cup at a time, and let the flour blend with each addition. We can add more flour 1 tablespoon at a time if needed, just until the dough is no longer sticky. I don't want it sticking to the side of my work bowl here. I don't want it to be sticking to my fingers. I can do a little finger test here and just test it by feeling it, seeing if it's sticky. Okay, so my remaining flour. So a couple things about my remaining flour. I know that my original ask of flour was 1 3/4 cups. I happen to have a 3/4 one here. But I already took 1/4 cup out of there. So what am I going to do? Well, I can do some kitchen math. The other thing I could have done in step 1 or before I got started, or part of my mise en place, is I could have measured in like a separate bowl, just put in a separate bowl my 1 3/4 cup, and then just measured this out, and then I don't have to think about it. I don't have to do a bunch of kitchen math. You could have done that. But if you aren't doing that, you will know that that's not the right one. There we go. Now we're in business. The remaining flour, that remaining flour is going to be 1.5 cups. So 1.5 cups plus my 1/4 cup that's already in there will equal that total amount of 1 3/4 cup. Like I said, if you pre-measured it all at first and just stole the 1/4 cup out of that pre-measure, you're good to go. You don't have to think about it too much. So I am going to add half a cup at a time, and then just let this dough hook mix things through as we go. I may pause this just because the mixer gets a little loud and it's just doing the same thing. That dough hook does take some time to work its way through. It's not super fast. It's efficient as a mixer, but it's a little bit of a delicate process. It might take a little bit of time. I'm gonna get some more flour in there. And then the other thing I want to keep in mind is because that dough hook, you can see, I just put some flour in there, but the dough hook does like to spill flour up over the top. So what I can do to kind of help encourage that is just use my spatula and just kind of nudge flour where it's really wet, where the flour needs to get in there and create a dough. So just like with our chocolate chip cookies, we had to scrape our bowl down a ton. Don't worry about having to scrape this down. Like be prepared, you might have to do it, and it's okay. You might need to kind of encourage that flour in there so that the flour is getting where it needs to go. So you can see I've got flour just kind of hanging out over the sides here. So let me get that in there. Scrape down my sides. All right, so see how that dough is hooked? It's just stuck on that dough hook. That's a good sign because it's coming into a dough. It's gonna fall off here in a second, but I want to scrape this down and get it working a little bit more, because what tends to happen is everything that sticks to the center of this dough hook stays a little bit more wet than everything else. The outside's had that flour in it, but it stays a little bit wetter here in the center, so I get that down, maybe turn it over or try to get a new bit of that like inside there out to the flour world. I do see a little bit of flour clumps, so I am going to keep mixing till it looks a little smooth, but like I said, I don't want it to be sticky anymore. Now that I've dumped that back in the bowl, it is sticking to the bottom of the mixer here. So you can kind of see how that's sticking to the bottom of the bowl. I do not want that. So I'm going to take that recommendation from the recipe and add a tablespoon more of flour and let it incorporate until I don't see it sticking anymore. And I'm going to add that kind of right down into that flour or into that dough. I'm going to add that right in there so that the flour is going to go exactly where I need it to. And then this may result in another time where we need to take it off the dough hook, reposition it. So it's sticking to the dough hook. It's looking a little bit more doughy. It's come apart. There's a bit in the bottom of the bowl, so that's a good sign. It's able to come apart. It's not sticking to itself there, but I want it to be a cohesive dough ball. So moving things around. I'm gonna do another tablespoon of flour. Like I said, I'm gonna try to put that flour where I think that it's needed, which would be kind of on top, on the sides. Where can I deliberately put that flour to where it's gonna do the most work, get into where I need it to. Okay, it's feeling a little sticky. I'm going to do a little bit more flour, extra little dough ball here, but the other indicator here is that it's still quite sticky to my dough hook. So it's getting better, it's certainly getting there, but it's going to need a little bit more flour. Oh, that feels much better. Flour everything everywhere. Wipe down my machine. Get it unplugged, and I'm probably just gonna get it out of here. Okay, so this dough ball, there's not a mass amount of dough on the side here, right? There's a trace of some dough, that's fine, it's just a dirty bowl, it's not gonna be spotless. But this dough ball, you can see I can obviously, it's not sticking to my hands. I can maneuver it. I don't have any flour on my hands. I'm gonna get some flour on my workstation here before I start kneading it. But it's definitely a dough that I can touch. It's not sticking to everything. We're good to go. We can start kneading. So with kneading, if you already have it in the mixer and you wanted to use the dough hook and let the machine knead it, so that's what that dough hook is for, it's going to knead this flour for you. It's going to work this. And what we're doing when we work this, and we learned in class that with kneading, is that we're developing those gluten strands. We're getting those tightly woven strands of gluten to come together so that when our yeast continues to eat our sugar, burp up the CO2, and now we have these bubbles and it's going to make our bread rise, that those tightly woven strands of gluten are catching them, so it has something to rise versus just escaping and being like big holes in what we've got. So we've got a bunch of little holes in our finished product. So if you wanted to use the machine to keep that kneading, go for it. But if this is your first time using yeast breads, I really suggest start kneading it by hand, because as I would mention before, if you're kneading this by hand, you're going to get a feel for what it is to knead and get a feel for what this dough feels like. Like right now it feels really soft. It should feel soft at the end, but you're going to start to feel a little bit of resistance as you start working your dough. So a little bit of flour, it's not crazy, it's not like I'm swimming in flour here, because this dough isn't sticking to me, but I just want to, as I work it, I don't want it to become sticking to me, sticking to the countertop. So a little bit of dough here. And so if I'm going to choose to knead by hand, as with my floured countertop, I'm going to use this motion, and what I do is I just fold it over and I use the palm of my hand to push out away from me. So I grab my fingertips here, grab this dough here, I fold it over, push away from me, and then I give it a quarter turn. So I'm just constantly grabbing this with my fingertips as I pull back, folding it over on top of itself. You can switch hands, but just kind of pulling, folding, pushing, pulling, folding, pushing. But the thing I wanted you to take note of and get a feel for is as you start working this dough, like this is starting to get a little resistance. It's starting to tear. I can see it's tearing. I don't really want that. I want it to be a smooth, cohesive dough. So I don't really want it to tear a lot. But it's starting to get resistant. It's starting to feel like I'm pushing on a bouncy ball. When I push on it, it doesn't really have a lot of give. It's kind of resisting me. So I am going to take that as a sign, because my dough is talking to me, my dough is telling me things, because I can tell by my visual cues and by feeling it, it's had enough right now. It needs to rest a little bit longer. It's had a rough day, right? We woke up this yeast, we gave it some sugar, we got it in the mixer, we introduced this yeast to it. It has gone through a lot right now. So I'm going to give it some time, give it a little time out here. Wrap it with my towel just so I don't get like a crust. I don't get a lot of air to hit this and I don't get a crust here. And I'm just gonna let this hang out for about 5 minutes or so. And it's gonna relax those gluten strands. Because like I said, what's happening is there's a lot happening here. Is all those gluten strands are really getting tightly woven and there's a lot going on. It just wants to relax, and then it's gonna be a little bit softer. It'll let me knead a little bit more. And then we can go for our giant rise time that we have. So I'm gonna let this sit for about 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, gave me some time to catch up on some dishes, so making sure that my hands were really nice and dry now as I return back to my dough here. But it feels so much different. It has such a different texture to it. It feels really, really soft. It's not resisting me like it was before. So I can get a little bit more kneading happening here. And I'm probably going to do this until it gives me that like resistance again. And then I'm probably good to let this rest, because our rest time that we have is going to be 2 hours. So like I said, I'll knead this about 10 minutes, not quite 10 minutes. Let's take that back. Because I did a little bit of kneading before. It also is kneading in that mixer. So it's not going to take me quite 5 minutes. But I want to feel that different texture one more time, but I don't want it to be tearing. If I see it tearing on the top like it was before, that's not really what I want to see. So I can knead this a little bit longer, but I want to show you what's going to happen when it goes into its bowl. So with step 5, I think I skipped your step 5 blank here. So step 5, turn dough out on a floured work counter and knead for 10 minutes. Floured work counter is your blank on step 5. And then step 6 is we're going to place dough on a lightly oiled bowl covered with plastic wrap and let rise for 2 hours. The dough should double in size. So a lightly oiled bowl. You might remember this trick with my coffee cake. How I greased my coffee cake pan. So I just use vegetable shortening. You have a pan spray, you have olive oil, vegetable oil, canola oil. Rubbing it around with that oil is going to work fine. I just happen to have this vegetable oil here. I like doing this trick here. And this is just to grease the bottom and sides of my bowl, because it does say it wants to double, so once it grows, it's going to get a little bigger, right? So wherever the dough is touching the side of this bowl, it's not going to stick. So when I'm done, I'm not having to scrape and pick it all out of this bowl here. Then it should just come out really nicely. While I'm at it, I do know that my baking pan, when I do get these baked, I'm going to need to grease my baking pan. So since I already got this out, got my paper towel already, I'm just going to grease this right now. This one for the baking does not need to get floured. Like coffee cake, we floured this one. Just some grease on it's just fine. So that when we're done, they pop right out, just like our dough will pop out. And then I'll get this working just a little bit more. So I have a nice little dough ball here. I've got my greased bowl. It just sets right into the center there. It's greased, so like I said, once it does rise and start to expand, touches the side of the bowl, it's not going to stick to that. So let me get some plastic wrap on this. And then this is going to go into my warm environment for 2 hours to rise. So if that's your stove, if you feel like your stove's getting a little too hot, turn it down or turn it off, because the stoves stay hot for a long time, right? I do suggest a towel. So whether it's just on your kitchen counter or whatever, anytime it's rising, get some sort of protective something on that, like a towel, maybe a towel underneath, towel on top. But we really want to, again, harbor this warm environment that we've created, so it's not going to get too cold, that it's going to actually rise and do what it needs to do. So this is going to get into my proofer, because that's what I got, for 2 hours. And then we'll get a few other mise en place things done while it's waiting for 2 hours. Let me get this in my proofer and then mise en place for a few more things. So since I have 2 hours to kill, I'm waiting for my dough to rise for 2 hours. Let's look ahead and see what else we can get done. I was able to kind of clean up and organize, get my dishes done that I've dirtied from now. So what else could I get done here? We have step 5 that I turned my dough out on a floured work counter. All right, so step 6 is that we place dough in a lightly oiled bowl, cover with plastic wrap, let it rise for 2 hours. There we are. Step 7, once dough is risen for 2 hours, preheat oven to 350 and grease our pan. Well, I got 2 hours to kill. So like I said, I got my greased pan just because I happen to have my grease out, so that's good. So where else can I go? Step 8 is I'm going to mix the cinnamon and sugar together and set aside. So this is that cinnamon and sugar that's going to go over the top once I roll out my dough. So let's put that together. I can certainly put that together. Now I can put my mise en place away. So this one was my 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar. And my 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, making sure we're not mixing those up. You're going to have quite a bit of cinnamon if you mix them up. So making sure 2 teaspoons. And then I just have this in a small bowl, and I just really want to mix them together. You can get a fork to mix them. Jiggle your bowl around. And I just have a cinnamon sugar mix. Like I said, that's going to get sprinkled over the top of my dough. I'm going to set that aside. So what else can I do? Can't do anything with my dough quite yet. Take a look, make sure I got my extra butter, like that first ingredient list. I've got butter that's softening to get spread through the middle. I've got butter that's melting that's going to go on top, and I'm just keeping those in my warm spot or on top of my warm spot. So again, I have my proofer here in the classroom. So I've got butter that's melting inside of it, and then I've got butter that's softening that's on top of it. So take advantage of those warm places that you have to get your butter the way you need to get your butter. It's kind of an advantage of having warm places. So the other thing that I'm going to do while I have my 2 hours here is I'm going to get my cream cheese frosting done. So my cream cheese frosting I'm going to put on the top of my cinnamon rolls once they've cooled a little bit. I don't want them sliding off the edge there, but I want to get this frosting done. I can just set it aside. So once my cinnamon rolls come out of the oven, I'm good to go, and I don't have any more prep to do. So cream cheese icing, pretty easy, pretty basic, just 4 ingredients. You'll see that at the very end of your recipe there. So with cream cheese icing, we're going to do 4 ounces of cream cheese. So I have here in my bowl 4 ounces of cream cheese. You want to make sure that this is soft, like room temperature. I did put this with my warm spot here to get my butter to get soft and my cream cheese to get soft. But this 4 ounces of cream cheese, if you buy those bricks, those flat bricks of cream cheese, when you open them up, you'll notice that it has ounce lines on it. So it has lines on it to tell you where 2 ounces is, 4 ounces, 6 ounces, the whole thing is 8 ounces. So it has lines on there to tell you where the ounces are. And then I also have 4 tablespoons of softened butter. I could use a stand mixer for this. I prefer not to because I don't need a whole ton of cream cheese icing. So the volume I have isn't enough for my mixer to work as efficiently as I want it to. I could, I just know that I'm going to have to scrape it down a lot, mix it, scrape it down a lot, mix it, scrape it down a lot, mix it. So I'm going to opt for one of these guys if you happen to have it. But like I said, if you have that mixer, it's great. It just, the volume is really low. It sticks down to the bottom, so it kind of flings up to the side of the bowl, and you have to scrape down a lot. So be prepared to scrape down a lot if you're going to do the mixer that way. I do want to, if I can help it, have some sort of mixer, because the way that you get that bright white fluffy frosting is because I'm going to be incorporating air with some sort of mixer. I've got these beaters here on this mixer. If you use the paddle attachment on your mixer, you're incorporating air. So just use that paddle attachment, not the whisk. But even the paddle will let you whip air into this frosting. That's why you get it nice and white and fluffy. I could totally mix this with my spatula or my whisk maybe at home. If I don't have a mixer, it'll totally come together. I would make sure this is really nice and soft though, so it's a little easier on you. But you may still see that kind of yellow color of the butter in there. So it may not be as white or bright as you might be hoping for. So with my electric mixer, I'm going to make sure that at first I'm creaming together my butter and my cream cheese until creamy. So all that's in here is butter, cream cheese. I'm going to use my mixer to cream that together till it's nice and creamy. Then I'm going to add my vanilla, then I'll add my powdered sugar. So I'm going to hang on to this bowl. So this is a good idea that if you're using one of these mixers, you might want to hang on to it, get a friend to hang on to it. Make sure you have nothing dangling, no strings of hoodies, long hairs tied back, anything else that might get caught in this guy. You want to make sure that you are going nice and slow to begin with so it doesn't flick everything around. And then again, you don't have things that are hanging over that are getting caught in here. So be careful with using one of these. So nice and slow to start. Now come together in a cohesive mixture. I try to focus on just staying on one side of the bowl just so I'm not chasing it around the whole bowl. I also don't have a bowl that's super giant, so I'm not just chasing it around like I'm trying to keep it a little easier on myself. So now I have a teaspoon of vanilla. And then I'm going to do 1 cup of powdered sugar. This giant tub is how I keep powdered sugar at school, so I got plenty of powdered sugar. So now I've got all my ingredients in there, but I have that powdered sugar, so be careful that when we start on that low speed. You may even have no speed and just kind of try to manually incorporate some of that sugar so you don't end up with a face full of sugar. It might make just a little bit of a mess, but I want to be a little bit aware that I've got sugar that could be flying everywhere. Okay, so I have all my ingredients mixed together. It's a cohesive mix, it's soft, it's frosting, but you might be able to notice a little bit of a yellow tinge, and that's that butter. So what I have is a mixer with the paddle that's going to incorporate air and whip that, and that yellow color is going to go away, and that's where you're going to get that really white, vibrant frosting look. So I'm going to crank this on high and get this whipping a lot more, and then I'll be back when it is nice and white and fluffy. So I whipped that maybe 2.5, 3 minutes, not much, but definitely on high, and really incorporated and whipped that air into it. And I can see it, I don't know how well you can see it through the camera, but I can see that it's definitely turned a little bit more of a brighter white. And it doesn't look so dense and heavy. And even as I just kind of move it around in the pan here, fold it through, it doesn't feel dense and heavy. It feels light and fluffy. So that's the beauty of having a mixer. Even if it's just this guy, I can get that air whipped in there, and it's super light and fluffy. So I've got cream cheese icing ready to go when my cinnamon rolls come out of the oven, which we're still a few steps away. And then I've got my cinnamon sugar mixed together so I can spread that on, sprinkle that on to my cinnamon roll. But I still have some time for my dough to rise. So I'm gonna let that finish rising. And then when I come back, we will pick up at step 8 that we want to make sure we preheat our oven, but then we're going to look at step 9 because we've already done step 8 here. So when we come back, we'll start working with rolling our dough out. All right, it has been 2 hours and I have my dough ball here that is risen. It's nice and big and fluffy. So we left off on step 6. Place dough in a lightly oiled bowl covered with plastic wrap and let it rise for about 2 hours. It should double in size. You can gently punch it down a little bit if you want to. You don't have to go kind of crazy with it because we are going to roll this out for our cinnamon rolls, so you don't have to go crazy. You can kind of make sure it's nice and soft. There's not like a crust on top. You can also see that we greased that bowl so I can pull that up and it's not sticking to the side of the bowl, so that's really convenient. So number 7, my step 7 here, once dough is risen for 2 hours, we're going to preheat oven to 350 degrees, and I already have my greased pan, so I'm going to get my oven preheated. I already mixed together my cinnamon and sugar. So step 9, generously dust flour over a clean work counter and place dough in the center. Sprinkle dough with flour, just enough to keep the rolling pin from sticking. And we're going to roll out to a rectangle. So in step 9, your blanks are sticking and rectangle. So a little bit of flour. Just so that as we roll our dough out, it's not going to stick. So the bottom of that, whatever was touching the bowl, is going to be a little bit wet. It's going to be more wet than the top. The top gets a little bit of a skin on it, but it's a little bit drier than the bottom. The bottom will be wet, so you want to make sure that you have some flour under there. And then a little bit of flour on top. You don't need to have a ton. Like I said, it tends to get a little bit of a skin on top, but you just want to make sure it's not going to stick to the rolling pin. If you also want to dust your rolling pin, you can certainly do that. So I want to roll this out into a rectangle. I'm shooting for a rectangle shape versus just round because I think it makes a better cinnamon roll at the end, something a little easier to square off. But you'll notice as I'm rolling, I'm lifting this dough up so it doesn't stick to the counter. So the more that I lift it or rotate it, it won't stick to the counter. It will ensure that I've got flour under there and it's not going to stick to my counter. As I'm rolling it, it might, start to get, I can feel that moisture in there. It might stick to my rolling pin, so I want to be careful that I'm adding flour as needed. Like I said, lifting, checking is really going to help from sticking. So step 10 is that I'm going to spread the soft butter all over the rolled out dough and sprinkle with the cinnamon and sugar mix. So I have that 3 tablespoons of softened dough, and I'm going to spread it all throughout here. So this dough is not like super thin. I don't know, maybe 1/4 inch or so, maybe a little less than that. You can also have a thicker dough. So the difference between a really thin dough, the thin dough, when I roll this up, I'm going to have lots and lots of little tiny layers in my cinnamon roll, but if you have a thicker dough, you won't get as many rolls. So that's kind of personal preference if you ask me. If you like your cinnamon rolls to be a little bit more big and fluffy with not as many layers, then don't roll it out so thick. If you want a whole bunch of little layers, kind of that pinwheel effect, then roll it out a little bit thinner. So that 3 tablespoons of softened butter, I'm going to spread On my rolled out dough, I have this spatula here. It just kind of helps make it a little easier to spread things out. If you have one of those offset spatulas, that works because then your knuckles don't get into the mix here. And just make sure it's nice and even, getting all of the edges. Because wherever your butter is, that's where your cinnamon and sugar is going to stick really nicely. So step 10 there, so I spread the soft butter, and then I'm going to sprinkle with the cinnamon and sugar mix. So I'm going to just use all of this mix and try to like evenly make it evenly distributed through this dough I have. Again, edges are important, so whoever gets that edge piece isn't getting ripped off. No cinnamon flavor, no cinnamon sugar. So step 11, roll the dough up to make one log. Cut the log up with a bench scraper. I'm going to use a bench scraper. You could use like a butter knife, even maybe that spatula I had, you could use that. It's obviously a soft dough, so something nice and easy to cut that dough with. I just have a bench scraper, I'll use that. So roll the dough up to make a log. Cut with a bench scraper is the blank there on 11, but if you have a butter knife, I recommend not a chef's knife. You don't want to be cutting unless you have a cutting board under there. You want to protect your knives so you're not cutting on something like that, a countertop. And then we're going to cut into equal-sized cinnamon rolls. So a few thoughts with rolling my cinnamon roll. I have a rectangle, so sort of a rectangle, but it's a lot longer this way. As I roll this way, I'm going to get a lot more layers, that pinwheel effect. If I were to roll this way, my log is going to be a lot longer. And I may not have as many layers, but maybe I'll get more cuts of the cinnamon roll. So kind of think about that. It's kind of personal preference, but if you kind of think about that thought process of how it's going to roll up long ways, you'll get lots of layers. But I like to just start nice and small, and then I'm just kind of using my fingertips to kind of tuck that up in itself. And as I'm kind of pulling a little bit, rolling and pulling, once I get a little bit of girth here, I can kind of just roll with my fingertips and then just pull from time to time to make sure it's not all super, super loose. So then now I'm ready to cut this up into equal portions. So this kind of depends on how thick you rolled everything out, how long your log is. I can't always, I mean, I'm probably gonna get quite a bit out of this because it's really, really long. So, but if yours is shorter, you just may not get as many, and that's okay. But the way I like to get nice and even cuts is I will first cut down the middle, like just cut that in half, and then now I'll focus on this half. And then I'll just cut this half in half, and then cut this half in half, and then cut that half in half. And hey, look, that looks like a pretty decent sized cinnamon roll. Get that in my pan. I have these thinner end pieces. I might just do a little something crafty and roll those up, because I feel like that end piece, you could kind of tuck it under, or maybe as you rolled it, tucked it under, but I feel like that's going to be a really kind of chintzy cinnamon roll. I don't really want to share that with someone. It seems a little small. So step 12, it says place the rolls cut side down on the greased pan. So that just means that you're placing them in the pan like this and not like this. You know, I'm sure we've all seen a cinnamon roll and we've got that nice spiral top. So placing them cut side down. Some of them might need a little bit of manipulation. Some of them might need a little encouraging to stand up. kind of scoot them down a little bit so they stand up nice and tall. Again, it kind of depends on how thick your dough was when you rolled it out. Make room for everybody here. So the rest of step 12 says that I put my cinnamon rolls cut side down, and then I'm going to brush the tops with a tablespoon of melted butter, and then I can start baking. But before I do that, I just want to stop and make a note. If you feel like, okay, I really want to make cinnamon rolls, but man, if I want to make cinnamon rolls for breakfast, I'm going to have to get up at like 3 a.m. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to do that. You could absolutely do this a day ahead of time. So all that 7-minute rise, the 30-minute rise, that 2-hour rise, the working with the dough, you can do that all a day ahead of time. So if you were to do this in 2 days, like I said, you wanted cinnamon rolls for breakfast, but you're like, I'm not getting up at 3 a.m. to make cinnamon rolls. This is where you would stop. You would stop at this stage, wrap this, put this in the refrigerator. Then the next morning, when you wanted cinnamon rolls, you still need to pull this out somewhat early. You'd need to pull this out of the oven or out of the refrigerator maybe like an hour before baking, just to get that chill off of this. As we've said, this is a yeast dough, so I want to be very careful with my yeast dough, and I want to know that it's live, it wants to rise. I just made it kind of dormant. I put it in the refrigerator and it's dormant, it's not doing anything. So if I were to put this in the refrigerator to bake it the next day, I would preheat my oven, get my oven kind of toasty, and then I would put my cinnamon rolls somewhere nice and warm. Again, creating that warm environment. Where can I put these that are warm? Because I want to take the chill off for one, and then I want to get that yeast kind of woken back up again so that they'll rise and puff up when I bake them. So keep that in mind. If you were going to do a 2-day process, you would stop here, plastic wrap, and then you could follow through the rest of the steps. But like I said, make sure you pull them out a little early so you have some extra time to get the chill off there. So carrying on, because we're going to get these in the oven, I want to brush the tops with my tablespoon of melted butter. So that last tablespoon of melted butter that I had on my ingredient list is coming into play here, where I'm just going to kind of tap the tops with the butter. It helps kind of get a little shiny on the crust and the sides of my cinnamon rolls. And then I'm going to bake in the oven for 20 to 24 minutes, or till the tops are golden brown. And then I'm going to rotate halfway through. This should sound familiar with all the other baked goods that we've done. So cut the time in half. I can always add time later, right? So I'm going to do 10 minutes, rotate 10 minutes more, and then check them. And I'll show you when I check them, and then they'll be good to go. Once they cool, we can add some of our cream cheese frosting. So we're going to get these baking. So my baking time is finished. I have cinnamon rolls here. It's hard to see on that camera, but I do have some golden brown happening. Golden brown happening down here, a little bit up here. They're getting firm. So we have like that toothpick test we see for a lot of yeast breads, quick breads, to tell if they're done. I feel like this doesn't work as well because we have this crust here, so when we put the toothpick in, it kind of pulls away any dough that could possibly be on the toothpick. So you could grab a couple forks and kind of pry in there and take a look, see that it's not doughy anymore. If you've got one on the edge, like I had one on the edge, I could pick up and see that it's not doughy anymore. Those are good indicators, but like I said, kind of getting forks in there and prying them apart, you can get a good peek to see what's going on in there. So they did grow a little bit. Because I did my dough so thin, I mean, I have all these pinwheels. They look really, really pretty. If I were to do this again, I would probably not roll my dough out so thin. I would keep it a little thick. And that's just personal preference. I feel like I would like a little bit more of that like bite of that fluffy, nice dough that we created. These still smell great. They smell like cinnamon. They look good. Like I said, they have lots of those pinwheels in them. I'm going to cover them with icing. I do want to let these cool for a little bit before I put the icing on there. I don't want to put icing on them right away because, number one, they're going to just fall right off. They're gonna fall right off of there and slide right off. I want them to cool just a tad. So get them cool just a little bit, and you can put them on where they're still a little warm, and then it sinks down into those crevices. So it sinks down into those crevices, but it's not too hot, it doesn't slide away. And then keep in mind that this recipe is also really easily done, doubled or even tripled if you wanted to. So if you felt like you wanted a little bit more dough, you can easily double this recipe. But there you have it, we got some cinnamon rolls.